Oh, goodness. Sorry about that. Ha. These days. So we're taking a break here to talk about Israel and Palestine, Zionism, etc. So, regional conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. A lot of this starts with Zionism, a political movement from the 1880s, really. The same time, a lot of nationalist movements were beginning all over Europe. A movement to create a national homeland for Jews. And that's when Hebrew gets revived from being basically a dead language of scripture and reformed and modernized into becoming a living language that you can use to have conversations and such. Palestinian movements, 1948, of course, Israel is established in the region mandated by the UN, alongside some extra land. We've already gone over this, but we can go and do the websites here. You can see the original UN partition plan from 1947 after the British left, that all the orange parts would be the Jewish state, and all the yellow parts, including Gaza and the West Bank, and up here near to the Lebanese border, would all be an Arab state, pretty evenly divided, 50-50 land, and then Jerusalem would be under UN administration. Of course, in 1948, the Israelis declared independence, and then immediately were attacked, and so the war started. By 1949, 1950, we have the UN armistice lines that ended up more or less where the legal definition of the state is now. If they had done this in 1943, of course, this would have been okay if Israel had tried to take all this land. But after, well, I guess technically they got away with it in 49. Even though if you remember the other chart, would have had more for the Palestinians, etc. Beersheba moves over into Palestinian, into Israeli territory. All of this near the Egyptian border goes to Israel as well. But of course, the problem is that once this is settled here by the UN along this armistice line, then it's set in stone. And so there's no way to get past that. As long as the UN is around, the UN is going to rule that these parts here, here, and here are occupied territory and not disputed territory, according to international law. That's just because we have the UN. If they had done it before the UN started in 1945, it would have been different. 1956, of course, we have the Suez Crisis. The 67, the Six-Day War, and that is when all of this West Bank territory, which was legally part of Jordan, the Gaza Strip was legally, sort of extra legally part of Egypt, occupied by Egypt at least. After 67 becomes occupied by Israel, West Bank becomes occupied by Israel as well. And the Jordanians gave up their right to it at some point. And then, of course, the Golan Heights become occupied by Israel after 67 in the Six-Day War. 1973, we have the Yom Kippur War. We already know about it. Sadat pursues peace in 79. Israel withdraws from most of the Sinai by 1982, and from Gaza in 2005, and from parts of the West Bank as well. So how we have it today, I think I already showed you this one. Area A, Area B, and Area C. So Area A, these are exclusively patrolled by the Palestinian Authorities police force. These, 7 cities. And then Area B are jointly patrolled by that Palestinian police force. They do have access to this territory, but the Israeli Defense Force also has access to those gray parts. And then the green parts are exclusively Israeli patrolled. So Palestinians live here under much more direct Israeli occupation, and no access at all to Palestinian police in the light green areas. In the gray areas, they have sort of joint access to both Palestinian and Israeli Palestinian police and Israeli military. And then in the red areas, those are exclusively ruled entirely by the Palestinian police force. They do not have a military by law. So Israeli identity, is it ethnic or civic? Is Judaism a religion, an ethnicity, or a racial identity? It's a little bit of all three. Definitely it's a religion. That's it. You know, its a primary function is as a religion. It is also something of ethnicity because Jews tend to speak similar languages. Part of this is historical, related to Orthodox observations. The observant Jews. Basically, here's how it works: people who are observant Jews who want to follow Mosaic law to the letter find that on Fridays they cannot travel more than a certain distance because it's there. You can't go on a trip on a Friday, on the Sabbath. Sorry, Friday night to Saturday night on the Sabbath. So because of that, Friday night is when you do your Sabbath your religious ceremonies, services, and so you cannot go farther than the synagogue on the Sabbath, which means you have to live within a certain distance from the synagogue. And there's ways around this. You know, you can get out of it sort of in very densely populated areas where it's very expensive to live in certain places. But for the most part, what it means is that it concentrates Jewish people in small communities. And when they get together and they're living together and working together and eating together and all the rest, then they develop these isolated lingua francas that we've just talked about, Judeo-Arabic, etc. So as a result, they tend to share a common ethnic identity, even when they are all Arab speaking Arabic. Their Arabic is a little bit different. Even when they are all American, English-speaking Americans, their English is a little bit different. So that's an ethnicity. And then racial identity, because of endogamy, because they really are strongly encouraged by their families and community members to marry within the religion. It turns out to be something of a racial identity, or at least it has become racialized in the past. Definitely they were targets of racism under European Christian rule, and even under current Jewish, I would say Jews dominate the state of Israel. And there is a racial aspect to non-Jews, at least with regard to Palestinians, Arab citizens of Israel. We're getting to that. So is Israel a nation state on the European or ethnic model, or on the American ideological model? A little bit of both. So it was founded as a homeland for the Jews. And so Jewish people have privileged access to Israeli citizenship. It's quite a bit harder to immigrate to Israel if you're not Jewish. It's much easier if you are Jewish. And then if you are a Jewish citizen and you're a Muslim or a Christian, it's a little bit harder. It's not quite as friendly to you. You know, laws, local ordinances, municipal ordinances, and stuff like that that are favorable to Jews tend to be tolerated within Israel in ways that similar laws might not be so tolerated for Muslims or Christians or Buddhists or Baha'is or whatever. You know, you can set up an entire street that's, you know, all Jewish, and nobody can buy property there who's not Jewish and that sort of thing. You can't do the same thing in the other way. Which does sound a little bit more like that ethnic European model. And then the two-state solution versus the one-state solution. These are the two options that we have. Is that there are two states. In the future, when you hear any American president ever mention the word Palestine in a State of the Union address, it's a thing. We count them. How many times did he mention Palestine? Oh, he mentioned it last, 2 years ago, and then the year before that. George Bush was a big one for this. He would mention Palestine all the time. He was elected by Palestinians in Cleveland. Came out in force in 2000 for George Bush, and so he mentioned the word Palestine. But when he mentioned it as a future aspirational state, a Palestine that is independent and powerful and all the rest, free, sovereign, independent state, trading with one another and maintaining ordinary diplomatic relations. This is the U.S. State Department's stated goal is that we would have two states. But if we look at that map, it is clear that the two-state solution would be very, very difficult to achieve. You can't really have a state with a bunch of islands that don't just have territorial waters to pass through, but are actually a different, an exclusive territory. So the police here can't go across the police there unless they basically become non-active, non-official civilians, and ask for permission to cross over. And each of these green areas in the middle here is a pretty sizable settlement of Israeli citizens living in the occupied West Bank. And that's very, very difficult to have a state when you have, it's not just islands with water in the middle, it's islands with other islands in between that are off limits, and really, these are where all the highways are that gets you through, that are exclusive access to Israeli citizens, etc., cutting through the West Bank. So it's really difficult to see how a two-state solution is going to work if we continue to have the West Bank chopped up like that. If the West Bank settlements are not removed, they have to be dismantled the same way they were dismantled in the Sinai, the same way they were dismantled in Gaza. When Israel turned Gaza back over to the Palestinians, they dismantled the settlements. There were Israelis living there in Gaza, and their homes were dynamited, and they were dragged away by the Israeli Defense Force, by the military, basically arrested them and removed them from their own property. And that's what they did to make Gaza a complete separate area, and they would have to do that to the West Bank as well. So politically, very unlikely.